Hi everyone, my name's Ben Hillier and I'll be your host on this episode. Today we're talking with Scott Tutton, the Program Manager of the Sports Program Team at the Australian Sports Commission, about volunteering in sport. This episode will cover Standards 5 and 7 of the National Standards for Volunteer Involvement and give you some practical ideas as to how your organisation can meet these standards and strengthen your volunteering practice. Scott, would you like to introduce yourself and give us a brief overview of your work relating to volunteering?
Sure. Thanks, Ben, and thanks for having me on. So my name's Scott Tutton. I work in the role as a Program Manager within our Sport Programs team at the Australian Sports Commission. I've been in that role since mid-2024 and previously led club and volunteer development as well as infrastructure and policy in roles at Cricket Australia, Cricket Victoria and Netball Australia, kind of over the past 12 or 13 years prior to that. I'm also a volunteer at a couple of local sporting clubs myself, so I sit on committees at golf and cricket clubs. But I think my favourite role is I deliver our entry-level cricket program at our local cricket club, which my 5 and 8-year-old daughters are both part of, which
lovely.
Yeah, great fun.
Fantastic. Well, jumping into the questions, can you tell us a bit about the work that your sports programs team do with volunteers?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Our role is primarily around the implementation of what's known as the Sport Volunteer Coalition Action Plan. So that plan was developed back in 2022 with an industry group alongside the Australian Sports Commission. And during my time at Cricket Australia, I was actually part of that industry group.
Right.
Purely with the aim and intent to transform the sport volunteer experience and to promote the value of volunteering in sport. So the focus of that plan is really on empowering sport organisations and volunteers themselves to achieve the vision of the plan, which is that people from all walks of life see and realise opportunities to contribute to individual, club and community goals in a way that suits them.
And when you're doing sports volunteering, both sort of the work you do for work and your volunteering, what kinds of people do you usually see volunteering there?
All sorts. Very much in a similar way as the players within sport vary greatly and are typically a really good representation of the Australian community. Volunteering is similar. But there are certainly some stronger representations within different pockets of sport that we see.
Mm-hmm.
So certainly within junior sport settings, we tend to see a lot of parents who are supporting the experience of their children in all manner of roles, but we do see a higher representation in some of those game day roles, so coaching and officiating / umpiring. We do see a lot of parents picking up those roles. We also see parents who turn up with the motivation really around giving back. So if they were the recipient of a great experience as a child in whatever sport they were lucky enough to participate in, quite often we'll see motivations of those parents just wanting to give back, feeling a sense of kind of accountability or responsibility to be able to ensure that others get the same experience that they did. When you transition out of junior sport settings into senior sport, we do tend to see a lot of both current and former players get involved as volunteers there, whether that be in those match or sport-specific roles like coaching or officiating, but also everything right down through operational roles like working the canteen or first aid or working parking, scoring, team managing, whatever the role may be, but also taking on those leadership roles in a decision-making capacity through committees and the like.
Brilliant. It's fantastic to hear that there is that diversity in sports volunteering. Excellent.
Yeah, there is.
Well, yeah, that ties into the next bit of our conversation. So the Centre for Volunteering's recently published a Volunteering in Sport report, which mostly focuses on New South Wales, but as you know, is applicable elsewhere. And I was curious about some of the findings we found in that report off you and your experiences to see how they stack up with each other. And the first one is kind of around the ways people get into volunteering. And the report observed that there was this natural engagement that you described where people participate in the sport and then gradually transition into volunteering through that participation. But one of the things the report flagged was that people may transition into volunteering, particularly as they age out of being able to participate in the sport in the same way. Does that stack up with your experience?
Yeah, it does, Ben. Particularly, there's some of the more higher contact sports, certainly, where you start to see players age out of that at a younger age. So sports like the football codes and others where players may not have a way of remaining involved as a player necessarily will transition into that volunteering capacity perhaps at an earlier age, or they'll actually have a break from sport for a period of time and then return in a volunteer capacity. We tend to see the dual role of player and volunteer happen in more of those non-contact sports, or where there's been formats of contact sports that have been heavily reduced in terms of the contact and the competitiveness to kind of allow it to be more social, where people will transition from that really competitive element into a less competitive environment, but pick up the volunteering side of things. So it certainly stacks up in terms of age. We do see some really strong representations in some sports of younger volunteers, where they've put in structures that really support it, and typically those work around coaching and officiating roles, where you will see high school aged players kind of getting towards the end of their schooling, actually picking up coaching roles as part of their vocation and starting to actually contribute back some of their learnings with the younger or first time participants. And the connection when the age is not so great in terms of the age gap between older and younger is actually a really positive experience for those young players coming in for their first experience. So we do see some programs that work really strongly in that space, but the evidence certainly suggests that we have an older demographic of volunteers in sport, which is not dissimilar to wider areas of the volunteering sector. But we do see some really neat pockets of younger volunteers starting to find their way within sport as well, which is great.
Yeah, right. And those programs that sort of scaffold younger volunteers getting involved, are there then pathways for them to continue their volunteering as they enter sort of young adulthood and maybe move from school to university or employment?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's some of the officiating programs. I know we've had some featured through the Australian Sports Commission's work from organisations like Basketball Queensland. Netball do a great job around a green sweatband or a green whistle program for some of their young umpires, where it's not just a talent pathway, but sometimes we'll actually find those volunteers have a greater level of enjoyment from officiating as opposed to what they do playing. It's positioned up front, it's a great way to understand the game from through a different set of eyes as a player. So if you're a young player, learning how to officiate gives you a different appreciation for the game, as well as for what other volunteers are contributing into your sport to allow you to have the playing experience that you do. But quite often that experience can then lead into, actually, I enjoy officiating more than what I do playing. I'm actually going to pursue this further. And for some, that motivation is to then ascend into a talent or an elite pathway to go and officiate at higher levels. For others, it's just the pure enjoyment of the activity itself. It allows them to remain connected to the sport, connected to their club or their competition that they're participating in. It's just a different way of being involved in sport, and there are definitely some sports that do that really well. I haven't named all of them and couldn't recount all of them off the top of my head, but those are two that come to mind who have done some really strong work that we've worked closely with over time.
Yeah, fantastic. One of the other things we looked at were barriers that stop people from engaging with volunteering or stop them volunteering more often. The big ones being time, cost, and sort of over-volunteering or volunteering burnout. Are these also the sorts of things you see restricting people's volunteering? And what sort of strategies have you seen being effective to alleviate this?
Yeah, the barriers certainly consistent, maybe with the exception of the cost. The cost was an interesting one when we were first reviewing the Centre for Volunteering's report around sport. It wasn't something that had typically come through in our own research into sport in terms of cost. But I think when we started to consider that more around non-direct costs, maybe the costs of travelling and fuel and, whether it be training or time where someone is not taking up a work opportunity, like an overtime shift as an example, and they're foregoing that to continue their volunteering because it's something they enjoy or that they feel a certain responsibility or onus to continue, then certainly cost would be represented in that. I just think it's something that in sport we haven't kind of matured our own understanding of exactly how that cost can play out in all sorts of different ways. But it was a fascinating finding to kind of dig into and to understand a little bit more about. And I think the figure was around $4,000 annually that was quoted in the report. And it was something that it really does stick out to you, but it's not something we've necessarily delved into in sport. We are doing a cost of sport research piece at the moment as part of our Play Well strategy, but it's been very much focused around the playing experience and registration costs and equipment and the like. But there's no reason those things aren't transferable across to the volunteer experiences as well. To pick up on your point around the burnout, absolutely. That's something that has shown up in our AusPlay research for the past few years. On average, we've found through that research that volunteers are performing three distinct roles within their organisation or across multiple organisations. I don't think any of those volunteers would have necessarily, when first putting their hand up to volunteer, would have volunteered for three distinct roles. It's certainly something that accrues over time. And what we're seeing is as people's time kind of extends, so if someone stays at a club or within a sport for 3, 5, 7, 10 years longer, those roles also tend to accrue. And some of that is that desire to not see a team or a club suffer. So you will see those established people within a committee typically start to pick up extra roles to help, and they will always use that terminology of help, where they will go from being a coach to being a coach and being on the committee, to being on the committee and supporting with apparel orders for a year, to then supporting with the travel of a team, perhaps to a representative competition, to extending into fundraising activity, and all of a sudden you have 5 roles. And the burnout accelerates at that point when you realise the kinds of things that you are responsible for. It can make things quite tiresome quite quickly. And I think the other factor to pick up on with that as it relates to burnout is the workload is only one component of that burnout. I think maybe one of the larger contributing factors to why volunteer burnout, and it's titled burden and workload and a whole range of different things in a whole range of different places, there's actually a real issue, I believe, with misalignment between why someone's putting their hand up in the first place, the understanding of why that is, the skills and experience that they bring, and a true understanding of exactly what that is, not just that I am a parent or I used to play, an understanding of the skills and experience that they would actually like to gain from volunteering themselves, so the individual motivation, and then the tasks that they're required to do and the way that they're required to do them. There is a really big gap, I feel, between, there are 60,000 community sporting clubs out there. Not all of them are guilty of this, but there is certainly a gap between the way that a club is positioning its volunteer offer and what someone is looking for when they turn up. And that communication doesn't always happen freely. And it's very different to the playing experience. When someone signs up to play in a social basketball competition, it's pretty clear what the value proposition is for that person when they pay $10 a Monday night or $100 a term or whatever it may be. It's pretty clear what the value proposition is. There are very few volunteers who are charged to register. There are costs, absolutely, but the upfront registration cost is very rarely one of them. So you're kind of freely giving your time and you're wanting to help, but sometimes you're also not able to, as the volunteer, to clearly express what it is that you're looking for. There are a range of tasks that are doled out at the first committee meeting or at the AGM, and people don't really speak up all that often and say, well, no, I'm not comfortable doing that, or I would actually prefer to do this task. It's an odd dynamic, and I think some more maturity and some more support from organisations like ours, from the ASC, in terms of helping clubs to be able to go through that process of understanding what is required, and then supporting them to explore the different ways in which tasks can be done and positioned, so that people have some more choice. If you go all the way back to the vision of the volunteer being able to contribute to individual club and community goals in a way that suits them, our role really is how do we help organisations support that vision rather than the vision of we've got to submit a financial report, we've got to select a team, we've got to raise money. It's very much framed in the club benefit rather than the individual, and I think bringing some more balance to that would certainly help to address what we see result in volunteer burnout. It's never designed as that, but it's resulting in that volunteer burnout because of the frustration, I think, at times between the motivation and the jobs to be done.
Are there any particular strategies or I suppose mini case studies you can think of that have done a really good job at kind of resolving some of these issues?
Yeah, I think sometimes micro volunteering is kind of positioned as that opportunity to dip your toe in the water to address this issue. So being able to clearly identify not necessarily the roles, but the tasks that need to be done, and taking a task that is given to one person and breaking it down into some more bite-sized chunks of work that are perhaps able to be done on a project basis, or just you can do all of this work in the pre-season. It doesn't mean you have to be involved with the club all the way through the actual playing season, as an example. So the micro volunteering piece certainly, but I think there's some other really good research and some insights in some work that we commissioned back in 2021, which is titled the Future of Sport Volunteering, which essentially outlines a whole range of different archetypes or representations of people who get involved with sports clubs as volunteers, and really trying to map out what their journey looks like. So an example of that would be someone like a lifelong fan. What are the things they like? They're typically sport obsessed, whether that be singular sport or multiple sport. They connect for particular reasons. They're looking to volunteer with others like them. Okay, what are they? And then actually working through and to identify their pain points. Okay, well, what are the things that they don't like? They don't want to be involved in roles that don't actually involve the playing of the sport necessarily. What that then lays out is a whole range of different opportunities in terms of the way that you would engage that lifelong fan and the types of roles or the types of tasks that you might start to think about engaging with them on, and how you might actually frame the questions to them of what you would like to get involved in. How would you like to do that? When would you like to do that? Which in the initial sense would certainly take some effort and energy from sporting clubs, but is actually tied all the way back to their own purposes to why they would exist, which is to bring people together in their local community through their chosen sport. So I think that there are some examples of that, be it micro volunteering, and there will be instances of things like that, I suspect, but for the large majority, and certainly what we see in terms of feedback and positivity of experience, that there's still some really large gaps that are missing there.
So one of the big themes we saw in the report was a discussion around volunteer abuse, and we saw this occur in a few different areas, one being external parties, so spectators, parents on the sideline yelling at a referee, but also being contexts where volunteers in one role, like a coach, are abusing volunteers in other roles, like a referee or an official, and particularly social media abuse. So a volunteer puts up an official club post and then have to deal with people not responding to them, but responding to the club or the decision or what have you. And this being a particular thing a lot of volunteers are experiencing. So I wanted to see, is that something you've also found in the work you've done? And have you seen, again, any strategies that work for reducing the abuse and taking care of the volunteers?
It's certainly something that gets a lot of airtime, isn't it? And it's not an area that we want to see more of. Like we don't want to see this taking place in local communities. We don't want to see this taking place on the big stage either. And I think that elite sport, unfortunately, has contributed to it in terms of some of the bigger broadcast sports, and what's shown on camera and what's shown on TVs to young impressionable minds at times is not always positive. If someone misses a kick in an AFL match on a Friday night, quite often you'll pan to the disappointed fan, or a decision goes the wrong way, it's going to the most passionate people, and unfortunately those views then are kind of being put on to those same people who love sport, who are the ones most likely to also be playing at a community level themselves. And that representation of that behaviour is not what community sport stands for, but unfortunately it is impressioned upon them. So the Coalition Action Plan has focused very much around a lot of committees and operational roles, because there is so much work that goes on specifically for coaches and officials elsewhere, both in like technical skills as well as behaviours and principles that they exhibit when they're delivering great experiences to players and participants themselves. So it's not necessarily the specific focus or part of the work that our team does within the action plan, but there are certainly a lot of organisations that we work alongside who are doing fantastic work in this space. Play by the rules, led by Tom Dixon and co, have been working in this area for many, many years, and have been supported by all levels of government, all the way down to local clubs. I think some of the work that the Australian Sports Commission is doing, in addition to its modern approaches to both coaching and officiating, is around our sector strategy, Play Well, which is all around increasing participation and providing opportunities for people to participate in sport. Certainly is involving some work where we are looking to deepen our understanding of the impact of positive cultures on sport. And I think this is directly related to how we start to address some of this volunteer abuse, all the way through to trying to define the culture of community sport. And that would involve, setting up what is the purpose of community sport, why does it exist, what are the values of community sport, all the way through to behaviours and principles. And I really do feel like that can help us address some of the things that we see on Friday nights, Wednesday nights, Saturday afternoons on local sporting fields and courts, where people are clearly confusing their community sport experience with that of an elite match, or even life and death at times. And ultimately it is detrimental to those same people who they claim to be supporting. If it's a coach or a referee or a scorer, like ultimately, if you ask them what their motivation is, quite often they'll come back and say, we want to see the kids have a great time. We want to see them build skills and confidence. And unfortunately, the words and the actions aren't matching up. So, I think some of the social media campaigns that are looking to come out and address some of these have been really positive. Even simple things like awareness raising through the use of like A-frame signs and the like at soccer fields and basketball courts, and that's not trying to single out those sports as being guilty of it more than anyone else. But in those places, you would just start to see some great reminders of why kids get involved in sport and what they're not looking for from those experiences, which is the over-involvement or maybe we'll call it too much passion or excessive passion from fans or coaches or otherwise, because there's no quicker turn off for young kids. And I'll speak from my own daughter's experience. There's no quicker turn off from being involved in a team sport or an individual sport than mum or dad getting too heavily involved and ruining their experience for them.
And it is a complicated issue to deal with. Like I know I used to volunteer as a soccer referee, and it was a nightmare trying to get particularly, adult men to take off their wedding rings, because the rules say you can't wear the wedding rings. They go, but at the Premier League, there's blokes wearing wedding rings. You go, well, can't control what the Premier League does, but you got to take the rings off, mate. And it's hard when you've got all these influences that you have no influence. You can't control that. You can't stop that, but you got to deal with the consequences anyway.
Absolutely. And it happens all the time. Like those are the same athletes and whatnot that they either are emulating or once aspired to many moons ago before their fitness and their skills deteriorated to the point where they're playing community sport. But that influence is really, really strong. And it is something that experiences like yours, Ben, and tens of thousands of others every weekend are facing. And it's a continual education for players in terms of all of the different roles and the investment of time and money that it takes for community sport to take place each and every weekend and each and every weeknight across the country. But also it's how do we start to create better support networks for those that are performing all roles, players included. But for some of those where the abuse is heightened as it relates to officials, unfortunately seem to be the ones who bear the majority of it, but committees, coaches as well, when it comes back to performance. Like there is a whole raft of negative experience that can be seen from time to time that we want to eliminate. I think that the idea is that people come together to have fun. Sport is primarily about fun. It then evolves into performance and competitiveness and self-growth and a whole range of other amazing kind of benefits and really good things when handled the right way. But it's supposed to be fun. We're supposed to do it with a smile on our face. And it's just trying to remind people of that at times and trying to demonstrate all of the great examples of that there are in the community, which is plentiful. There are heaps of them.
Fantastic. Well, to shift things in a slightly more positive direction, we did get a number of recommendations from volunteers and volunteer managers, things like improve flexibility for volunteers, increase the professionalism of sports volunteering and volunteer management, and look at reducing some of those indirect costs, particularly in rural and regional New South Wales. How do some of these recommendations relate to what you've seen and some of the recommendations that your own work has made that you see as being important to the sector?
Yeah, those are fairly comprehensive, Ben. I think they're pretty close to what we see, and the same things that we talk about when engaging with national sporting organisations and state sporting organisations and state and territory governments. But I think the one that we might add to that list would be a recommendation specifically at some of those national and state sporting bodies, and just ensuring that they have volunteers as a strategic priority. So how do we ensure that the contribution of those people is recognised, for one, but also that they're seen as that strategic asset to their sport. They are the primary deliverers of experience into the community, and at times I think we can take that for granted a little bit in terms of the sheer weight of that contribution. And again, I know the Centre for Volunteering's report into sport showcased exactly what that is worth in terms of economic value, and I think they are both. They need to be recognised for how much that value represents. We're not suggesting that NSOs and SSOs invest that amount of money necessarily in replacing them. That's not what we're saying, but just that value is recognised. And then I think that they, as a cohort, are recognised as being on an equal kind of footing as what those who play sport are. So quite often they're referred to as, the volunteers as enabling an experience for someone else, when in fact they are worthy themselves of a positive experience, be they a coach, be they a committee member, be they someone turning a sausage on a barbecue. Like, they are doing that to have their own positive experience as well as contribute to someone else's positive experience when playing the sport. So that is worthy of focus, it's worthy of investment, and it's worthy of kind of continued effort and energy from administrators to make sure that they're taken care of. And that their skills and experiences are as positive as anyone else's. So I think if we can ensure that experience is front and centre in design thinking, whether it be a club level, whether it be a local government level, whether it be, again, for ourselves at federal government level, just making sure that we are thinking about the experience for the volunteer, not the experience that the volunteer is trying to give someone else, then I think we will address a lot of those outcomes that have resulted in a lack of flexibility, too high a cost, volunteer burnout. I think we'll actually address some of those things that have started to emerge more and more within our sporting environments by putting the volunteer at the front and centre of it rather than the system at the front and centre of it, which is not why we do it in the first place.
So looking at your work more generally, what sort of things do you do to facilitate recruiting and training volunteers?
So recruiting volunteers, there's not a great deal of directly by the Sports Commission. We tend not to deliver activity ourselves, but we certainly work side by side with national sporting organisations more specifically in terms of supporting them to develop recruitment strategies if that's what they're after. But more often around training volunteers and identifying the types of skills that those volunteers are going to require to perform their roles. So we do support them with a lot of that identification work and trying to gather information about their volunteers so they can understand them better and then start to design training or education needs that are a little bit more specific to particular cohorts within each of their sports or within regional and rural areas as opposed to metropolitan areas, because we see great difference in the volunteers that tend to put their hands up and the roles that they perform based depending on where they're based geographically as well.
Mm. Brilliant. And do you do any particular programs to recognise volunteers and the work that they're doing?
We do. So through the Coalition Action Plan, we've launched the Sport Volunteer of the Year Award. So we've been through 3 iterations of that beginning in 2022. So we this year have been sourcing nominations from all over the country at all levels. And we had our winner, a woman named Julie Keylor, who's a paddle coach from Shepparton, which is in regional Victoria, ran an amazing all abilities paddling program up there in Shepparton. I say up, it's north of where I am. It's probably south of where a lot of your listeners may well be from. A fantastic way for us to be able to recognise volunteers' contribution right next to some of our most well-known coaches and athletes from the Olympic and Paralympic movements who are recognised on the same night. So that is one way in which we recognise the work of volunteers and really try and shine a light on their stories. The other is through National Volunteer Week, which, depending on when you listen to the podcast, it may either be behind you, but for when we're recording now, it's in a couple of weeks' time here in the middle of May. So we will support the sports sector with the production of social media assets, messaging, web banners, EDMs, posters and the like to be able to join our campaign, which is titled 3 Cheers for Volunteers. So again, that's 3 years in the making as well. And it's gone from strength to strength over that period of time in terms of the amount of organisations who are recognising volunteers publicly throughout the course of that week. But I think the evolution of that for us this year is the inclusion of what we're calling a National Volunteer Map. So it will be released on the first day of National Volunteer Week, and it's a way for us to visually represent as many volunteers as we can in all corners of the country. So people have the ability to nominate others. Quite often they won't nominate themselves. We know volunteers, they don't like heaping praise on their own backs.
Absolutely.
They're happy to say thank you to someone else. And they're able to identify them by name, their sport, the club, but most importantly, why they volunteer and what they give. And what we'll then be able to see is this stunning kind of visual compilation of all of those stories together, which we'll be able to hopefully then live on way out past this National Volunteer Week and just be a continual way where we can capture volunteer storytelling and showcase that to not only the sports sector, but the rest of the volunteering sector more broadly as well, which is a fantastic asset for us to have and really keen to see how that goes this year.
That sounds brilliant. Looking forward to seeing that. Yeah. So to wrap up, are there any other things around this topic you'd like to comment on?
No, nothing to comment on, Ben, other than just to extend a thanks. We're very fortunate in sport to have around 3 million volunteers that give their time willingly, and community sport just wouldn't operate without that level of volunteering. We, like every part of the volunteering sector, would love to have more, but what we have is just such a fantastic contribution from people from all backgrounds, experiences, that are just so willing to give their time to ensure that sport happens, regardless of what sport that is, everything from ice racing to equestrian to tennis to hockey to swimming. Yeah, there are people who are standing there with stopwatches or notepads scoring, and it is such a fantastic movement, and I'm very lucky to be part of a select group who are able to talk about this all day, every day, and trying to find different ways to be able to support and make sure that same experience is had by people for generations to come. The challenge is certainly a large one in terms of making sure that we can adapt quickly enough to the younger generations and what it is that they're looking at or looking for from a volunteering experience. But it's an awesome challenge that our team are ready to take on, as is the rest of the sports sector. So, just a huge thank you, Ben, for letting us come on for a little while and to talk about sport volunteering. It's an area we're passionate about, and hopefully there's something there for others to be able to pick up on and maybe adapt into their own industry.
Yeah, thank you for your time, advice and expertise. That's been fantastic. Where can people go if they want to find out more about your work and the Sports Commission's work on volunteering?
Yeah, so you can visit the Australian Sports Commission's website, so ausport.gov.au, and from there you can navigate to the volunteering section and have a look at the Sport Volunteering Coalition Action Plan. You can also sign up to be an official supporter of the Sport Volunteer Coalition and its action plan as well, which kind of keeps you in the loop. You can also sign up to our newsletter and stay abreast of all of the news and webinars and education offerings that we kind of throw out into sport. But yeah, that's where I'd go first. Head to the website.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again for your time, Scott. And thank you to our listeners. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode. And I look forward to seeing you all again next month. Bye for now.